On July 12, 1982, in a factory in Kalamazoo, Michigan, a welder set down his torch and walked out for the last time. He had welded the same steel frame in the same building for 36 years. He clocked out, picked up his lunchbox, and crossed the parking lot without looking back. For 60 years, one car had defined every American city: yellow, boxy, built like a bank vault. 6 adults could fit across the back seat. The floor was flat enough for 4 children to sleep on. A single checker marathon could run 500,000 miles before its frame ever cracked. Then in the summer of 1982, Checker stopped making cars, just stopped. No press conference, no farewell speech. The factory went quiet. The workers went home. And here is what almost no one understood at the time. The company did not fail. The cars broke down. It failed because they did not. Chapter 1. The Coat Maker Who Bought a Factory. Morris Markin arrived at Ellis Island in the spring of 1912. He was 19 years old. He carried $8 in American currency and a single trade. He could sew. He had been born Mir Markin on July 5, 1893, in Smolensk, a city in western Russia where Jewish families lived under the constant arithmetic of fear. Pogroms came without warning. A neighbor's farm could be burned in a single night. Boys his age were conscripted into the Tsar's army for terms that often lasted a quarter century. When Markin turned 19, he made the calculation that saved his life. He left. He went to Chicago because Chicago needed tailors. The garment district along Halsted Street ran 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, in buildings without ventilation. The air was thick with cotton dust and steam from the pressing tables. The pay was poor, and the hours were brutal, but Markin saved every dollar he could. By 1919, he had enough to open his own shop, a small clothing manufacturer making women's coats. He hired other immigrants, mostly Jewish refugees like himself. He paid slightly better than his competitors. He did not cheat his workers on hours. The business survived. But Markin was restless. Coats wore out in a season. They went out of fashion. They were burned, stained, or thrown away. He wanted to build something that would last. In 1922, that opportunity arrived in the form of a debt that could not be paid. The story is more tangled than most accounts suggest. Through a series of investments and consolidations, beginning around 1920, Markin acquired a controlling interest in the Lomberg Auto Body Manufacturing Company of Joliet, Illinois. Lomberg supplied bodies to a struggling carmaker called Commonwealth Motors. When Commonwealth ran short of cash, Markin stepped in. The result, after months of restructuring, was a new company headquartered in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Its name was the Checker Cab Manufacturing Company. His friends in Chicago thought he had lost his mind. What did a coat maker know about building automobiles? Markin's answer, as he later put it, was simple. He knew how to build things that did not fall apart. The material did not matter. Wool or steel, the principle held. You build it right, people buy it. You build it cheap, it falls apart, and they hate you. He moved to Kalamazoo and walked the factory floor. Then he did something none of his predecessors had done. He went to Chicago and New York and stood in taxi garages, talking to drivers and fleet owners. He asked them what broke. He asked them what lasted. The answers came back the same. Everything broke. Passenger cars converted into taxis fell apart in 18 months. The seats were too narrow for a 12-hour shift. The doors were too small for elderly passengers. The trunks were too shallow for steamer luggage. The suspensions cracked from constant loading. Nobody, Markin realized, was building cars for taxi work. They were building cars for families and forcing them into a job they were never designed to do. In 1923, the first true checker rolled out of Kalamazoo. It looked like nothing else on American roads. It was tall and boxy and unconcerned with style. The rear door swung open 90 degrees. The frame was reinforced steel, heavier than anything Cadillac or Buick was selling. The engine was deliberately understressed. It would never win a race, but it would idle for 10 hours in Manhattan traffic and start again the next morning. Chicago fleet owners bought the first Checkers cautiously. Within a year, they were ordering more. The Checkers were still on the road when the cars next to them were in junkyards. Then the taxi wars began. By 1925, Chicago's streets had become a battlefield. Rival taxi companies hired men with baseball bats and tire irons. Cabs were firebombed in the middle of the night outside garages on the west side. Drivers were beaten in alleyways. Some carried revolvers. The newspapers ran the stories on the front page for years. Prohibition was at its height, and the taxi business in Chicago was as bloody as the bootlegging trade that ran alongside it. Markin refused to fight on those terms. While his competitors spent their money on muscle, he spent his on engineering. By the end of the decade, the companies that had hired gangsters were broke. Checker was thriving. Then the Depression came. Most American manufacturers collapsed in the years after 1929. Checker did not. The reason was simple. Even in a depression, a city still needed taxis. Businessmen needed to reach their meetings. Travelers needed to leave train stations. The wealthy still moved through the world and still required rides. The number of cabs on the streets fell, but the cabs still running needed to be indestructible. Checker fit that requirement perfectly. By 1937, the company was the largest taxi manufacturer in America. Word of mouth in the industry was Checker's only advertising, and it was enough. Then came December of 1941. In 1942, civilian automobile production stopped across the country. Detroit converted to military manufacturing. Kalamazoo did the same. The Checker plant began producing shell casings, aircraft components, and parts for military vehicles. Throughout the war, Markin kept every single worker on the payroll. When peace returned in 1945, the Kalamazoo factory resumed building taxis with a workforce that was loyal, experienced, and ready. Soldiers were coming home. American cities were swelling. Families were forming. The country was about to need more taxis than it had ever needed. By 1947, Morris Markin had something no other American carmaker possessed. He had a template, a formula, a philosophy of building, refined across 25 years, that had survived street wars and depression and a global conflict. It would dominate American taxi fleets for the next 35 years, and it would carry inside it the seed of the company's destruction. Chapter 2. The Cab Itself. Step inside the Kalamazoo plant in the spring of 1958, and the first thing that hits you is the sound. The welding bays run along the north wall, and the rhythm of the arc welders is constant. A low electric hum, punctuated every few seconds by the bright crack of an ignition. The air carries the metallic tang of hot steel and ozone. Sparks fall in slow arcs to the concrete floor, where they go dark. A welder named Frank, 51 years old, has been at this station since 1946. He is laying the final joints on a ladder frame for a 1958 Checker A8. The frame in front of him is a flat rectangle of welded steel rails, 11 feet long, joined by crossmembers thick enough to stop a thrown brick. He works without speaking. His hands know the joints by memory. This is where every Checker began. Not with a stamping press or a styling clay, with a frame. Most American sedans of the late 1950s shared this construction philosophy. Cadillac, Lincoln, Buick, even the Ford Crown Victoria of that era, all rode on body-on-frame platforms. What separated Checker from its peers was not the architecture. It was the dimensions of the steel. Checker frame rails ran thicker than anything else in production. The crossmembers were heavier. The gussets at every stress point were doubled and sometimes tripled. A Cadillac frame was engineered to survive 60,000 miles of suburban driving. A Checker frame was engineered to survive 2,000 miles of stop-and-go cab service in Manhattan. The wheelbase was 120 inches. A 1958 Chevrolet Bel Air rode on 115. Those 5 inches translated into something every passenger remembered. The rear seat of a Checker Marathon could fit 3 adults across with room to spare. But the rear seat was not what made the Checker different. The floor was. Most American cars of the era had a high transmission tunnel running down the center of the rear footwell, a hump that forced middle passengers to splay their legs around it. Checker engineers redesigned the drivetrain layout to lower that tunnel until the floor was nearly flat. A passenger could stretch out fully. A grandmother could climb in without lifting her feet. Children, as countless families would later remember, could lie down and sleep on the carpet during the long ride home from the airport. Behind the front bench, 2 jump seats folded down from the back of the front seat. A fully loaded Checker Marathon could carry 7 passengers and a driver. Try fitting 8 people in a 1958 Plymouth. The doors weighed 60 pounds each. The hinges were oversized castings, the kind you might find on a commercial freezer. The handles were solid metal, not chrome-plated plastic. When you closed a checker door, it did not click. It thudded. The sound carried weight, like the dull boom of a bank vault sealing shut. The engines came from outside the company. For the first 3 decades of production, Checker used the Continental L-head 6-cylinder. Beginning in the mid-1960s, the company switched to small-block Chevrolet power plants. The Chevy 230 and 250 inline 6s, the 283 and 327 V8s, and eventually the 350. This was not a minor footnote. It was the secret of the Checker's reputation for reliability. Because Checker bought its engines from General Motors, every internal component shared parts with millions of other American cars on the road. The water pump that failed at midnight in Queens was a Chevy water pump. The carburetor was a Rochester, the same one rebuilt by every gas station mechanic, from Boston to Los Angeles. The fuel pump, the alternator, the starter, the distributor. All of it was Chevrolet. A Checker could be diagnosed and repaired by any competent mechanic in any garage in North America, with parts sitting on the shelf. This was the real reason Checkers stayed on the road. Not magic, not mystery. Parts commonality with the largest automotive supply chain in the world. The suspension followed the same logic. From 1958 forward, the Checker Marathon rode on independent front suspension with coil springs and A-arms, a design adapted from General Motors passenger cars. The rear was a solid axle on leaf springs, simple and rugged. Every component was off the shelf. The Kalamazoo factory in 1958 employed over 1,000 workers. None of the work was automated. Every frame was welded by hand. Every body panel was hung by hand. Every door was fitted by men who could hear, in the sound of the latch closing, whether the alignment was off by a 1/16 of an inch. Markin walked the floor as a habit, not a ceremony. The men knew him by his first name. Many of their fathers had known him too. Sons trained at the same workstations where their fathers had spent 20 years. These were not transferable trades. They were Checker trades. By 1965, the Marathon had crossed over from product into icon. Walk into any taxi garage in Manhattan that year, and at least 6 out of every 10 cabs on the floor were Checkers. In Chicago, the number was 7 out of 10. Boston, Philadelphia, San Francisco. Same story. Checker was not the most common taxi. It was the standard against which all other taxis were measured. By the late 1970s, Checker had become so synonymous with the American taxi that it was used as cultural shorthand. When ABC launched a sitcom about cab drivers in 1978, the show was simply called Taxi. The garage scenes were filmed inside the Sunshine Cab Company set, and the cars parked in those bays were Checker Marathons. Every one of them. Tony Danza, Danny DeVito, Christopher Lloyd, Andy Kaufman. For an entire generation of American viewers, that garage and those cars became the visual definition of urban working life. That same year, the director Paul Schrader made a film called Blue Collar, shooting parts of it inside an active automobile factory in Michigan. The film starred Richard Pryor, Harvey Keitel, and Yaphet Kotto. When a director wanted the audience to know, in 3 seconds, that a scene was taking place in an American city in the post-war era, they put a checker on the screen. Nobody at Kalamazoo was thinking about how it would end. 3,000 miles away, at the Ford Fleet sales office in Dearborn, Michigan, a memo was being drafted. It concerned a new pricing program for taxi operators. The program would offer financing terms that no small manufacturer in America could match. Chapter 3. The Empire at Full Height. To understand what Checker had built by the mid-1960s, stand on the corner of 42nd Street and Park Avenue at 5 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon in 1965. The light is failing. The buildings cast long shadows across the cross streets, and the avenue in front of you is a moving river of yellow. Hundreds of checker marathons fill every lane. They idle at the lights, 3 abreast, 4 deep. Their engines hum at the slow chuckling rhythm of an understressed Chevrolet 6. The drivers wear short-sleeve white shirts, ties loosened, cigarettes burning between their fingers. Gasoline is 35 cents a gallon. The dispatcher voice crackles through every radio. This is the empire at full height. By 1962, Checker was producing approximately 7,000 cars a year out of Kalamazoo. By 1964, that figure had pushed past 8,000. The factory ran 3 shifts. The parking lot overflowed onto the surrounding streets. A second cafeteria was added to handle the lunch crowd. 60% of every taxi rolling through Manhattan was a Checker. In Chicago, 70%. Boston, Philadelphia, San Francisco, the same. Checker was not the leading manufacturer. It was the only manufacturer that mattered. Consider the math from the perspective of a Brooklyn fleet owner running 40 cabs in 1965. A new Checker Marathon cost roughly $4,500. A Ford LTD sedan, the closest fleet alternative, cost about $3,200. The Ford looked like the better deal until you ran the numbers across a service life. The LTD would need replacement after 5 years of taxi work. The Checker would still be running at 15. Over the same period, the Ford fleet had to be bought 3 times. The Checker fleet had to be bought once. On total cost of ownership, including downtime, repair bills, and capital outlay, the Checker won every calculation. The drivers loved them for different reasons. The high seating position gave excellent forward visibility through Manhattan traffic. The bench seat let a driver stretch his legs across a 12-hour shift. The mechanical simplicity meant fewer breakdowns and fewer hours lost in the garage. Some drivers ran the same Checker for 8 or 10 years. They knew its quirks and rattles the way a man knows the floorboards of his own house. By 1968, the Checker had moved past being a product. It had become part of the visual language of the United States. Photographers shooting urban scenes for Life magazine framed their compositions around them. Tourists from Iowa took photographs of yellow cabs and brought them home. Postcards sold in Times Square showed Checkers stacked at intersections. The car was no longer just transportation. It was a symbol of New York the way the Empire State Building was a symbol of New York. When ABC launched the sitcom Taxi in September of 1978, the choice of Checker for every car in the Sunshine Cab Company garage was not a creative decision. It was a documentary decision. To depict an American taxi garage authentically required Checkers in every bay. Anything else would have looked wrong. But there is something worth noting about the timing of that show. The pilot episode aired on September 12, 1978. By that date, Checker production had already fallen to roughly 3,000 cars a year, less than half its 1964 peak. The factory was running 1 shift instead of 3. The parking lot was no longer overflowing. While American audiences settled in to watch Danny DeVito bark at his drivers from inside the dispatcher cage, the real garage in Kalamazoo was beginning to empty out. The show ran for 5 seasons. When the series finale aired in May of 1983, Checker had been out of the automobile business for 10 months. In retrospect, Taxi was not a celebration. It was a eulogy that nobody recognized at the time, broadcast in primetime to 20 million Americans every week. The decline had begun 3 years before the pilot ever aired. In a corner office in Dearborn, Michigan, in the early months of 1973, an internal memo was being circulated within the Ford Motor Company Fleet Sales Division. The memo concerned a new financing program intended to capture the urban taxi market. It proposed 2% interest rates for fleet operators. It proposed parts availability through every Ford dealership in North America. It proposed a coordinated assault on the segment Checker had owned without challenge for 50 years. The memo was approved. What no one in Kalamazoo yet understood was that the assault would not come from Dearborn alone. Chapter 4: A War on 3 Fronts. The first front opened in Dearborn. By the early 1970s, Ford had decided that the urban taxi market was worth fighting for. And the weapons it brought to that fight were not the kind a small manufacturer in Kalamazoo could match. The Ford Crown Victoria Fleet program offered 3 things Checker could not. The first was financing. Through Ford Motor Credit, fleet operators could buy a new Crown Victoria at 2% interest. A checker buyer paying through a regional bank would face 6 or 7%. On a 40 cab order, that spread translated into tens of thousands of dollars a year. The second was parts. Every Ford dealership in North America stocked Crown Victoria components. A broken water pump in Brooklyn could be replaced in 90 minutes with parts pulled off a shelf in Queens. A checker also had parts availability for its Chevrolet engine, but the body-specific components, the door handles, the bumpers, the heavy ladder frame parts, all had to be ordered from Kalamazoo, 3 days minimum, sometimes a week. The third was scale. Ford was selling 2 million F-150 trucks every year. The profit from those trucks subsidized aggressive pricing on the Crown Victoria. Checker had no second product to lean on. Every dollar of compliance cost, every dollar of marketing, every dollar of warranty service had to come out of taxi sales. A point worth making here, because the audience watching this story will know it. The Crown Victoria was not a cheap car. The police interceptor variant of that platform would go on to log 250,000 miles in patrol service before it was retired to taxi work, where it would log another 150,000. The Crown Vic was a tank in its own right. Built differently from the Checker, but built to last. The competition in the 1970s was not between a durable taxi and a disposable one. It was between two different philosophies of durability, supported by two radically different cost structures. The second front opened in Detroit, at Chrysler. The Plymouth Fury and the Plymouth Grand Fury, both powered by the legendary Slant 6 225 cubic inch engine, became the quiet favorite of taxi fleets that valued lightness and fuel economy over raw mass. Mechanics had a name for that engine. They called it the Slant 6 that would not die. It ran on cheap gasoline, it tolerated abuse, it started in winter when nothing else would. Plymouth fleet pricing was aggressive. The cars were 500 pounds lighter than a Checker. They accelerated faster, cornered better, and burned considerably less fuel. Some drivers working 10 and 12-hour shifts came to prefer them. They complained that the Checker was too heavy, too slow off the line, too tiring to wrestle through traffic for an entire shift. The steering wheel was unassisted on older models. The body would lean hard in a fast turn. The fuel economy in city driving was bleak, around 10 miles per gallon when it was running well. Not every cab driver in America loved the Checker. Some had been waiting years for an alternative. By 1972, Plymouth and Ford between them had captured a meaningful share of the taxi market. Checker still led, but the lead was shrinking. The third front opened in October of 1973. OPEC announced an oil embargo against the United States. Within weeks, the price of gasoline jumped from 35 cents a gallon to over $1.25. Service stations ran dry. Lines of cars stretched around the block at every pump that still had fuel. Some stations posted signs reading out of gas and locked their doors for the duration. The American economy convulsed, and every fleet owner in every city sat down at his desk with a calculator and ran the numbers again. A Checker Marathon in city traffic returned roughly 10 miles per gallon. A typical cab logged 50,000 miles a year. At the new gasoline price, that meant $6,000 a year burned on fuel for every Checker on the road. A Ford Crown Victoria, by comparison, returned about 16 miles per gallon. The same 50,000 miles cost roughly $4,000 in gas. A Plymouth Grand Fury fell in between, around 14 miles per gallon, costing about $4,500 a year. The spread was $2,000 per car per year. Across a 40-cab fleet, $80,000 annually. Over a decade, the fuel savings alone exceeded the cost of replacing the entire fleet twice. The math that had made the Checker the obvious choice in 1962 made it the wrong choice in 1974. Morris Markin did not see this final crisis as the company's leader. He had stepped back from active management in the late 1960s, handing day-to-day operations to his son David. On October 8, 1970, Morris Markin died at the age of 77. He had founded Checker 48 years earlier. He had survived the Chicago taxi wars, the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and a half-century of competition. He did not live to see the oil crisis. He did not live to see the regulations. He did not live to see what happened to the company he built. What he had left behind, in his son and in his factory, was a philosophy. Build the most durable taxi in the world. Never compromise on the formula. Never pivot. The philosophy had been correct for 60 years, and Markin had taken it to his grave with confidence intact. David Markin inherited a company that looked healthy. 3 years later, the entire economic foundation of that company was gone. The man who replaced his father was not a builder. He was a son holding a company together against forces his father had never imagined. He tried. By every account, he tried hard. But the formula his father had refused to change had now become the inheritance he could not escape. The checker was too heavy, too thirsty, too expensive to manufacture at the volumes it now sold. And every quarter, the numbers got worse. The market had moved on. The checker had not. But the economic war was only half the assault. While David Markin was fighting Ford and Plymouth and the oil cartel, a second wave was already moving toward Kalamazoo. It was coming from a place his father could not have anticipated, and his lawyers could not deflect. It was coming from Washington. Chapter 5. When Washington Came. The regulations were not aimed at checker. That is the first thing to understand. They were aimed at the entire American automobile industry, written by men in Washington committee rooms who were thinking about smog over Los Angeles and crash fatalities on the interstate system. They were not thinking about a small taxi factory in Kalamazoo. The checker problem was an accidental consequence of laws that, by the standard arithmetic of fairness, applied to everyone equally. Equally was the wrong word. The Clean Air Act of 1970 required every car sold in America to meet new emissions standards on a phased schedule running through the decade. Ford spent roughly $200 million meeting the first wave of those rules. Spread across 2 million vehicles a year, the cost came to about $100 per car. Checker faced the same standards. The company did not design its own engines, but Chevrolet did. And when Chevrolet rolled compliance costs into the price of its small block engines, Checker had no leverage to negotiate. They were buying 8,000 engines a year out of millions. They paid the new price, or they did not buy. The increase passed straight through to the cost of building each car. For body-specific compliance, the math was harder. The same $10 million in engineering work, spread across 2 million Fords, came to $5 a car. Spread across 8,000 checkers, it came to $1,250. Then came the safety standards. Bumpers capable of withstanding a 5-mile-per-hour impact. Side impact protection. Mandatory crash testing. The big manufacturers were redesigning their cars on 3 to 5 year styling cycles anyway, and folded the new requirements into work, already underway. The checker had not been significantly redesigned since 1956. Compliance meant retooling. Retooling meant tens of millions of dollars checker did not have. Then in 1975, the corporate average fuel economy standards arrived. The CAF rules required every manufacturer's lineup to meet a fleet-wide miles per gallon target. The checker fleet consisted of one model. That model weighed over 4,000 pounds and returned 10 miles per gallon in city service. There was no way to comply. By 1977, Checker was losing money on every taxi it sold. Manufacturing cost exceeded sale price. Raising prices accelerated the defection of fleet operators to Ford and Plymouth. Holding prices guaranteed losses. There was no good direction to move. David Markin understood this. The reports came across his desk every Monday. Black for revenue, red for cost. The red column had been growing for 4 years. By the late summer of 1977, his accountants were no longer projecting a return to profitability. They were projecting how many years the company could continue at current loss rates before the cash position became untenable. He kept the factory running. He did not lay off the senior welders. He continued to walk the floor the way his father had, stopping at workstations, asking the men how their families were. The workers who had been there 20 and 30 years could tell something was wrong. They had watched the parking lot empty out shift by shift. They had watched the second cafeteria close. Production in 1978 fell to roughly 3,000 cars, less than half the 1964 peak. The workforce, which had stood at over 1,000 men a decade earlier, was now 400. Two-thirds of the assembly bays sat idle. The night shift had been eliminated. By 1980, everyone inside the Kalamazoo factory knew what was coming. The question had stopped being whether Checker would survive. The question had become how many more cars they could build before the end. The men kept welding. The men kept fitting doors. They did the work the way they had always done it, on cars that nobody outside the building would ever see new. 2 years of work, performed at full skill, by men who knew their craft was about to disappear from the world. Chapter 6. The Last Summer. David Markin spent the last 4 years of the company's life trying to keep it alive. He pitched the Marathon to retail customers as a roomy family sedan. The advertising emphasized the cavernous back seat, the bulletproof construction, the American manufacturing. It failed completely. No suburban father wanted to drive a car that looked like a taxi. At 10 miles per gallon in an era of expensive gasoline, the Marathon was unsellable to anyone watching the pump. He took on contract manufacturing work. The factory built body panels for General Motors. It built airport shuttle buses, hearses, stretched limousines for funeral parlors and hotel chains. Anything that kept the equipment running. The contract margins were thin and the work came in unpredictable batches, sometimes leaving the assembly bays empty for weeks. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. By 1980, Checker was producing roughly 1,000 cars a year. The factory ran one shift, 4 days a week. The death spiral was simple to describe and impossible to escape. Low volume meant high per unit cost. The only way to lower per unit cost was higher volume. Volume was falling, not rising. There was no exit. In the spring of 1982, David Markin made the decision. There was no announcement, no press conference, no farewell tour. He authorized a brief internal memo stating that automobile production would end in July. The taxi business, after 60 years, was over. The last Checker Marathon rolled off the assembly line on the afternoon of July 12, 1982. It was painted yellow. It carried serial number 829. That number is worth pausing on. 20 years earlier, the factory had built 8,000 cars in a single year. In the entire calendar year of 1982, 829 was the total. There was no ceremony. The men did not gather. There was no speech from David Markin. The car simply rolled off the end of the line, was driven around to the loading dock, and was prepared for shipment. The afternoon shift ended at the regular time. The men picked up their lunchboxes. They walked across the parking lot to their cars. Some of them lit cigarettes. A few cried in the privacy of their own vehicles before driving home. Most just drove home. The welder mentioned at the beginning of this story was 64 years old. He had started at Checker in 1946, the year after the war ended, and he had welded ladder frames for 36 years, without significant interruption. He left the building with a small severance check and no pension. He was too young for full Social Security and too old to be hired by anyone else. This is the part that deserves to be said clearly. Who hires a 64-year-old welder whose specialty is welding the joints of a Checker frame to tolerances that will hold for 200,000 miles? The answer is no one. That skill, accumulated across 36 years of repetition, did not transfer. It belonged to a single product made in a single building, and when that building stopped making that product, the skill became obsolete in the course of an afternoon. He was not alone. The men who knew how to fit Checker doors, so they would still close perfectly after 250,000 miles. The men who could test drive a finished cab and identify a misadjusted suspension by sound alone. The men who had taught their sons the same trade at the same workstations. All of that institutional knowledge evaporated on a single Monday afternoon in July. The factory itself did not close. It converted to full-time contract work, but the work that had given the building its identity was over. There is a postscript worth knowing. The cars that had already been built kept running. Through the rest of the 1980s and into the 1990s, Checkers continued rolling through New York City streets. The very last Checker in regular New York taxi service was retired in July of 1999, 17 years after production ended. The odometer on that final cab read just over 400,000 miles. It was still running on the day it was retired. The proof of Markin's engineering philosophy was complete. Checker had built the most durable taxi in American history. The cars had outlasted the company that built them by nearly a generation. By the early 20s, the surviving Checkers existed only as artifacts, museum pieces, restoration projects in private garages. Classic car shows where retired men in their 70s would walk slowly around a perfectly preserved 1972 Marathon and remember the first time they ever rode in one. In 2022, the Kalamazoo factory was demolished. Graphic Packaging International, an industrial company that had grown alongside the Checker plant for decades, expanded onto the property. The assembly buildings came down. The welding bays were leveled. The private test track behind the plant, where every Checker built in those 60 years had been driven before it left for service, was paved over. There is no marker, no commemorative sign, no bronze plaque on the property line indicating what was once made there. The site of the Kalamazoo Checker factory is, as of this writing, a parking lot for a packaging company. 1,000 men once stood on that ground. They built taxis that outlived the buildings that produced them. Chapter 7. What Checker Left Behind. The paradox sits at the center of everything. Checker succeeded at exactly the goal it had set for itself. The company built the most durable taxi in American history. By every engineering measure Morris Markin had cared about across his 50 years of building things, the Checker Marathon was a triumph. 500,000 miles on the original frame, engines that ran for decades, doors that closed in 2025 the same way they closed in 1965. And the perfection killed the company. Consider the arithmetic from a fleet owner's point of view. A Checker bought in 1965 was still running in 1985. That single sale generated revenue once and then disappeared into 20 years of profitable taxi service for someone else. A Ford Crown Victoria bought in 1965 needed replacement by 1970. The same fleet operator returned to Ford 4 times across the same 2 decades. 4 times the revenue, 4 times the manufacturing volume, 4 times the economies of scale that allowed Ford to undercut Checker on price. The durability advantage Markin had spent his life refining was, by the bookkeeping of the modern automobile industry, a structural disadvantage. Checker had built itself out of business one taxi at a time. The second truth is harder. Niche dominance is not a defensive position. It is a temporary one. For 60 years, Checker owned the American taxi segment so completely that no major manufacturer bothered to compete for it. The volumes were too small. The customers were too specialized. When Ford and Plymouth finally decided in the early 1970s that fleet sales were worth pursuing, the protection vanished overnight. Checker had no scale, no dealer network, no captive financing arm, no second product to subsidize losses. The advantages of being the biggest fish in a small pond meant nothing once larger fish entered the water. Could the company have been saved? Probably not as a mass manufacturer. The economics by the late 1970s were too far gone. There were 2 paths that might have worked. The first was to abandon the fleet market and reposition as an ultra-premium product, the Rolls-Royce of taxis, sold to high-end car services, willing to pay a premium for craftsmanship. The second was to sell the company to a larger manufacturer in the early 1970s, when it still had a profitable name to offer. The Markin family chose neither. They had built the company from a coat shop in Chicago. Selling meant admitting it was dying. They held on through the regulations, through the oil crisis, through the steady erosion of fleet orders. By the time they were willing to discuss a sale, the company was worth almost nothing. Every restored Checker Marathon at a classic car show today, gleaming in fresh yellow paint, doors thudding shut, with that same bank vault sound, is a perfect monument to Morris Markin's engineering philosophy. The cars work. They work as well as they did 60 years ago. And every one of those surviving cars is also a quiet piece of evidence that his philosophy destroyed the business that produced them. Every Checker preserved in a private garage in 2026 represents a customer who bought once and never came back. The cars succeeded. The company did not. 1,000 men once welded steel in a factory in Kalamazoo, Michigan. They built taxis so well that those taxis lasted 20 years on the streets of New York. That achievement, by the unforgiving mathematics of mass-market manufacturing, eliminated the repeat sales that would have kept their factory open. The Checkers survived. The plant did not. The men are mostly gone now too. The welders and the door fitters and the test drivers. The streets once filled with yellow cabs have moved on to other cars and other companies and other ways of getting home. If you remember your first ride in a checker, the wide bench seat, the heavy door, the flat floor, the feeling of sitting in something built like a tank, leave that memory in the comments. It matters. It is part of what is left. If this story changed how you think about American manufacturing and what was lost when companies like Checker disappeared, the next one in this series is about another empire that died the same way, for many of the same reasons. The factory is gone. The cabs are still here. If you rode in a Checker, you remember it. The wide bench seat, the heavy door that closed like a vault, the flat floor where your kids stretched out on the way home from the airport. Tell me about your first ride in the comments below. Where were you going? Who was driving? Those memories are part of what is left of the company now. If this story moved you, hit the like button so more people find it. Subscribe and stay with the channel. The next one is about another American empire that built itself out of business, one perfect product at a time.